I stood in front of 300 people at my father's 60th birthday party, and I destroyed him. Not with anger, not with violence, with the truth he thought he'd buried forever. My name is Lauren Whitmore, and this is the story of how the daughter no one saw coming brought down an empire built on lies. Stay until the end, because what happened after that party will shock you even more than what I did during it. If you saw Charles Whitmore on the news, you'd see a self-made billionaire, a titan of New York real estate, a man who reshaped the Manhattan skyline and commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. The media loved him. Investors worshipped him. Politicians sought his endorsement. But none of them knew the real Charles Whitmore. None of them were his daughter. I'm Lauren, his firstborn, the one he pretended didn't exist. And this is my story. A story about family, betrayal, and what happens when the invisible daughter finally steps into the light. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about justice. And sometimes, justice looks like watching the man who denied you finally face consequences he never thought would come. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Lauren Whitmore, and for most of my life, I was a ghost in my own family. The celebration I'm about to tell you about took place on a crisp October evening in Manhattan. My father's 60th birthday party was held at the Riverside Grand, a private event hall with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. The venue alone cost more than most people earn in a year. Crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna hung from vaulted ceilings. A 20-piece orchestra played classical arrangements. The birthday cake, a towering 6-tier masterpiece decorated with edible gold leaf, had been flown in from a renowned patisserie in Paris. 300 guests filled the room. CEOs, politicians, old money families whose names were carved into New York's foundation, media executives, fashion designers. Everyone who mattered in Manhattan's elite circles was there. Champagne flowed freely, waiters in white, gloves circulated with caviar and imported delicacies. Photographers captured every carefully orchestrated moment. Everything about the night screamed legacy. My father, Charles Whitmore, stood at the center of it all. At 60, he was still commanding. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, he moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He was a titan in real estate, development, ruthless in negotiations, brilliant in strategy, adored by investors, and absolutely feared by his competitors. In public, Charles Whitmore was magnetic, charming, generous with compliments, and strategic with his attention. He knew exactly how to make powerful people feel seen. In private, he was something else entirely. Cold, exacting, deeply, profoundly disappointed in anyone who didn't mirror his impossible standards or serve his vision of perfection. That disappointment had a name. Mine. I was his first daughter, born 28 years before that glittering party. Born before the money, before the penthouse apartments and the private jets, before the city bent its knees to the Whitmore name. I remembered the early years with startling clarity. The years when my father was still fighting his way up. When my mother, Rebecca, worked double shifts as a hospital administrator while he studied development contracts at our small kitchen table under a flickering light. I remembered those nights. The smell of coffee that never quite masked his exhaustion. The sound of his pen scratching across legal documents. The cramped apartment in Queens where the heating barely worked in winter. I remembered believing, truly believing, that we were a team. A family united against the world's indifference. That one day, when success came, it would be ours to share. I was wrong. Success did come. First slowly, then all at once. A gamble on a warehouse district that shouldn't have paid off but did. A partnership with the right investor at exactly the right moment. A rezoning application approved against all odds. Suddenly, Charles Whitmore wasn't struggling. anymore. He was rising. And as he rose, everything changed, including our family. When I was 7 years old, my father met Victoria Ashford at a charity gala. She was everything my mother wasn't. Society connected, polished, born into the kind of wealth my father was desperately trying to reach. Within a year, my parents were divorced. Within 2, my father had remarried. And then came Ava. My younger sister arrived when I was 9. From her first breath, she was raised differently than I had been. Where I grew up with hand-me-downs and public school, Ava had private tutors and designer clothes. Where I learned to be grateful for what we had, Ava learned to expect excellence as her birthright. Where I was taught that family meant loyalty, Ava was taught that family meant winning. My father's transformation was complete. He'd shed his past like an old skin. The struggling developer was gone. In his place stood Charles Whitmore, real estate mogul. And in his revised personal history, there was very little room for the daughter, who remembered when he'd been ordinary. By the time my father reached 60, he'd made a decision. The past no longer served him. Neither did I. But here's what he didn't understand. Being invisible gave me Ava, and I were never natural enemies. We were carefully crafted into opponents. From the moment she could walk, my father compared us. It started small, innocent even. Comments at dinner about Ava's grades versus mine. Observations about her poise when she spoke to his colleagues. Praise for her ambition when she declared, at age 7, that she wanted to run the Whitmore Group one day. When Ava spoke, my father leaned in. His eyes lit up. He asked follow-up questions, genuinely interested in her thoughts, her plans, her vision for the future. When I spoke, he corrected me, interrupted, improved my phrasing, suggested I think more strategically, reminded me that in business, feelings were liabilities. By the time we reached adulthood, our roles in the Whitmore family were crystallized, undeniable, set in stone. Ava was the heir, the chosen one, the daughter who would carry the Whitmore legacy into its next golden era. I was the background, the support system, the daughter who existed to make things run smoothly while others took credit. The differences in our upbringing were stark. Ava attended elite private schools, Chapin for elementary, then Dalton, then Princeton for undergraduate studies, followed by Harvard Business School. She spent summers interning at Fortune 500 companies my father had connections with. She traveled to real estate conferences in Singapore, London, Dubai. She was photographed at charity galas, always positioned next to our father, always perfectly styled, always saying exactly the right thing to exactly the right people. I took a different path. Not by choice at first, but eventually by strategic decision. I stayed closer to home, attended a good state university, worked part-time jobs throughout college, learned the business from the inside, not from the glamorous exterior, but from the machinery that actually made everything function. I understood contracts, vendor negotiations, risk assessment procedures, compliance structures, the things no one applauds at, shareholder meetings, but without which everything collapses. Ava learned how to shine, how to command a room, how to make investors feel confident and board members feel valued. I learned how things actually worked. That difference would matter more than either of us realized. Our relationship was complicated. We weren't openly hostile. In fact, to outsiders, we probably seemed relatively close. We had dinner together occasionally, exchanged birthday gifts, texted about family obligations, and shared the occasional inside joke about our father's peculiarities. But underneath the surface civility, we both understood the truth. There was only one throne in the Whitmore Empire, and our father had already decided who would sit in it. Ava never apologized for being the favorite. Why would she? She'd done nothing wrong except be born at the right time to the right mother. She was brilliant in her own right, genuinely talented at the strategic thinking our father valued. She understood market trends, Could read a development proposal and identify weaknesses instantly. Had a gift for knowing which politicians to court and which investors to pursue. But she also had something I never did. Our father's unconditional approval. And that approval made her dangerous in ways she didn't fully recognize. It made her believe she was untouchable, that the empire being built in her name was secure, that the sister working quietly in the background posed no threat whatsoever. That was her first mistake. Her second was more personal. She saw what was happening to me, the quiet exclusion, the systematic erasure from our father's plans, and she chose silence. Not because she was cruel by nature, but because speaking up would have cost her something. And in the Whitmore family, you never, ever paid a price you didn't have to. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, 2 months before the party that would change everything. I was at my desk in the Whitmore Group offices, reviewing vendor contracts for an upcoming development in Brooklyn when my computer chimed. The sender was my father's executive assistant, Margaret. The subject line read, "Succession Finalization, Whitmore Group." I almost deleted it, assuming I'd been copied by mistake. Then I saw my name in the body of the email. Or rather, I saw where my name should have been. And wasn't. The attachment was a 60-page legal document outlining the formal succession plan for the Whitmore Group. Every detail was there. Share transfers, voting rights allocations, board appointment procedures, strategic authority distributions, assets, responsibilities, future growth, projections, all of it flowing to Ava. The document was comprehensive, meticulous, clearly the work of months of planning with top-tier legal counsel. It addressed every possible scenario: economic downturns, hostile takeover attempts, regulatory challenges, family disputes. My name appeared exactly 3 times in 60 pages, twice in footnotes about historical company structure, once in a section labeled Non-Essential Legacy Stakeholders. Non-essential. Legacy. I read that phrase 7 times before the full weight of it settled over me. My father hadn't just decided to favor Ava. He decided to erase me from the future entirely. But what cut deepest, what actually took my breath away as I sat in that sterile office, wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the clarity of intention behind it. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a draft or a preliminary discussion. The document was finalized, dated, signed by my father and his attorneys. Board members had already been consulted. Key investors had been briefed. Everything was in motion. My father didn't just want to overlook me in his succession planning. He wanted to replace me in the family narrative, to write a story where I'd never really mattered at all. I sat at my desk for 3 hours after reading that email. People walked by. Phones rang. The normal rhythm of office life continued around me. But I couldn't move, couldn't process anything, except the brutal arithmetic of my own irrelevance in my father's eyes. 28 years of loyalty, of showing up, of doing the unglamorous work that kept projects on schedule and vendors happy, of never complaining about being overlooked, never demanding recognition, never making my father choose between his daughters. None of it had mattered, because I'd made a fundamental miscalculation about how my father's mind worked. I'd believed that competence would be rewarded, that quiet dedication would eventually be seen, that being indispensable in operations would translate to being valued in succession. But my father didn't value what was reliable. He valued what was reflective. And when he looked at me, he didn't see the future of the Whitmore empire. He saw a reminder of who he used to be. That was unforgivable. That night, I went home to my small apartment in the West Village. Not the penthouse suite my father had offered Ava. Not a property in the Whitmore portfolio. A place I'd rented with my own money, decorated with my own choices, where no one could enter without my permission. I poured a glass of wine, sat on my balcony, overlooking a narrow street, and made a decision. I wasn't going to beg for recognition. I wasn't going to plead my case or compete for approval. I was going to do something my father had taught me, though he'd never intended the lesson for.
Me.
I was going to play the long game, and I was going to win. People who adored Charles Whitmore never saw the man I grew up with. The media painted him as a visionary, a self-made success story, someone who'd pulled himself up through intelligence and determination. Articles praised his business acumen, his philanthropic contributions, his mentorship of young entrepreneurs. They never mentioned what it cost to be his daughter. The public Charles Whitmore was charming, generous with advice, quick to praise promising talent. The private Charles Whitmore was something else entirely. I was 12 the first time he told me I was too soft to matter. We were at dinner, just the two of us, a rare occurrence even then. I'd been excited, had prepared things to tell him about school, about a debate competition I'd won. I thought he'd be
Proud.
Instead, when I mentioned feeling bad for my opponent who'd cried after losing, my father put down his fork. His voice was calm, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "Lauren," he said, "successful people don't waste energy on other people's feelings. That's why they're successful, and those people aren't. You're too soft. That's going to be a problem for you." I was 12, and my father had just told me that empathy was a weakness. The lessons continued throughout my adolescence and into adulthood, each one delivered with the same calm certainty, the same absolute conviction that his worldview was the only realistic
one.
Love without power is useless, Lauren. Power without ruthlessness is temporary. People respect strength. Everything else is noise. Ava understands that winning is all that matters. I wish you did. He never yelled. Yelling would have been easier to dismiss as momentary anger. My father's cruelty was colder, more calculated. He dismissed, and dismissal leaves scars that shouting never could. I watched him with Ava, the striking difference in how he engaged with her. When she'd come home from school with an A- instead of an A, he'd ask probing questions about what she'd do differently next time. Strategic debriefing. Room for growth. When I came home with the same grade, he'd barely look up from his newspaper. Expected, he'd say, and return to reading. When Ava expressed interest in the business, he'd spend hours explaining deals, walking her through negotiations, introducing her to mentors. When I asked questions, he'd sigh. "You wouldn't understand the complexity, Lauren. It's not personal. You're just not built for this level of thinking." Not built for it. As if intelligence, like eye color, was simply genetic and immutable. By my 20s, I'd learned to stop seeking his approval. Stopped bringing him accomplishments to celebrate. Stopped hoping that one day he'd see me the way he saw Ava. But I never stopped watching him. And what I saw was this. Charles Whitmore didn't just value winning. He valued the appearance of dominance. That subtle distinction would become crucial, because appearance could be challenged. Dominance built on secrets could be dismantled. My father had carefully constructed a public image of self-made success, of ethical business practices, of fair dealings and strategic brilliance. But I knew the truth. I knew about the zoning official who'd received a Whitmore Foundation scholarship for his daughter the same week he approved a controversial variance. I knew about the building code violations that had been quietly settled rather than disclosed. I knew about the shell companies used to obscure ownership in deals that couldn't withstand public scrutiny. None of it was illegal.
My father was far too careful for that.
But all of it contradicted the image he'd cultivated. The image that secured investor confidence. The image that protected his empire. For years, I'd kept these secrets because I believed we were family. Because I thought loyalty mattered. Because I hoped that eventually my father would remember I existed. That email in August changed everything. If I was non-essential to his legacy, then his secrets were no longer mine to keep. 3 weeks before the party, I confronted Ava. We met at a coffee shop in Tribeca. Neutral ground. Away from the office, away from family properties, away from our father's looming presence. Ava arrived exactly on time, as she always did. Perfectly dressed in autumn cashmere and tailored trousers. Hair sleek. Makeup understated but flawless. She looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury brand advertisement. She smiled when she saw me, the same smile she gave to investors and board members. Warm but ultimately distant. "Lauren, this is a nice surprise. I thought you'd be buried in the Brooklyn contracts today." I didn't return the smile. "I need to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to be honest." Her expression shifted slightly. The professional warmth flickered. "Of course." "Did you know about the succession plan?" The question hung between us. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, Ava's mask slipped.
I
Saw calculation behind her eyes. She was deciding how to play this, whether to feign ignorance or own the truth. She chose truth, or at least her version of it. "Yes," she said simply. "I knew." "For how long?" "Long. 6 months. Maybe 7. 7 months. While I was working 60-hour weeks on projects that would ultimately benefit her empire. While I was negotiating contracts that would secure her future. While I was solving problems that would have derailed her inheritance. She knew. And you said nothing." Ava leaned back in her chair. Her voice remained calm, almost compassionate, which made it worse. "What was I supposed to say, Lauren?" "Dad made his decision. This is how these things work in families like ours." "Families like ours." "Ours."
Yes.
Families with legacy assets. With empires to protect. You've worked in the business. No succession can't be democratic. Someone has to lead. And that someone is you. Dad thinks I'm better suited for it. I can't change his mind. Neither can you." I stared at my sister, really looked at her, trying to find some trace of the little girl who used to share secrets with me, who used to ask for help with homework, who used to say I was her favorite person. That girl was gone. If she'd ever really existed, "You could have warned me," I said quietly. "You could have prepared me. You could have advocated for me, or at least acknowledged what was happening." Ava reached across the table, put her hand on mine. The gesture felt rehearsed. "Lauren, I love you. I do. But this isn't personal. This is business. This is survival. If I'd fought Dad on this, what would it have accomplished? He'd already decided. All I would have done is damage my own position. And for what? To make you feel better for a few days before the same result happened anyway?" She actually believed this. I could see it in her eyes. She genuinely thought she was being rational, strategic. That choosing self-preservation over loyalty was simply smart business. "You chose silence," I said. "You chose to benefit from my erasure rather than risk anything to stop it." Ava withdrew her hand. Her expression hardened. "Yes, I did. Because this is how families like ours survive. The weak get sentimental. The strong do what's necessary. Dad taught us both that lesson. I learned it. You apparently didn't." There it was. The final proof that my sister had become exactly what my father wanted her to be. Someone who valued winning over everything else. Over fairness. Over compassion. Over family. I stood up. "Thank you for being honest." Ava looked confused, maybe even concerned. "Lauren, wait. Let's talk about this. Maybe we can find you a role in the new structure. Something meaningful. You're good at operations. We could create a position that—" No. I don't want a consolation position in your empire, Ava. I don't want to be quietly accommodated. Then what do you want? I looked at my sister one last time. "I want you to remember this conversation. After the party, when everything changes, remember that you had a choice. And you chose this." I left before she could respond. That was the moment I stopped seeing Ava as my sister and started seeing her as my opponent, not my enemy. The distinction mattered. An enemy you fight directly, emotionally. An opponent you outmaneuver strategically. And I had just realized something crucial. Ava was brilliant at the game my father had taught her, but she'd never learned to play a game she didn't know existed. My father made a critical error in how he utilized me within the Whitmore Group. He thought he was being efficient, pragmatic, using my competence in areas that needed attention without giving me real power. What he actually did was give me complete access to the Empire's machinery. While Ava was being groomed for the visible throne, learning to charm investors and navigate board politics, I was being assigned the unglamorous work that actually kept the company functioning. Vendor contracts. Every single one. I reviewed them, negotiated them, maintained the relationships, compliance structures. I knew every regulatory requirement, every permit process, every legal standard the Whitmore Group had to meet. Internal audits. I coordinated them, responded to them, ensured everything passed scrutiny. Risk assessment. I identified potential problems before they became actual crises. I was invisible to my father's strategic thinking, which meant I was unmonitored. And that gave me something neither my father nor Ava possessed: complete understanding of where the Empire's vulnerabilities actually lived. Not in dramatic boardroom battles or hostile takeover attempts. In the details. The fine print, the carefully worded contracts, and the precisely calibrated compliance measures that kept everything legal but barely. I didn't set out to sabotage my father. That would have been illegal, unethical, and ultimately ineffective because it could be blamed on malice rather than natural consequences. Instead, I did something much simpler. I stopped protecting him from himself. The Whitmore Group, like most large development companies, operated in a gray area of legal compliance. Nothing egregiously illegal, but plenty of practices that relied on no one looking too
closely.
Vendor relationships that bent conflict of interest guidelines. Political donations timed strategically with permit approvals. Construction timelines that barely met code requirements. For years, part of my job had been managing these gray areas, making sure inspectors were scheduled when work was actually compliant, ensuring donation records were separated from permit applications by enough time to avoid obvious correlation, keeping vendor relationships documented in ways that obscured potential conflicts. I'd been the invisible safety net, and I simply removed it. I didn't change anything. I just stopped preemptively fixing problems. When a vendor contract came up for renewal and I noticed language that could be problematic, under new disclosure requirements, I didn't revise it. I just processed it as written. When an internal audit flagged a timeline concern on a Brooklyn project, I didn't quietly resolve
it.
I forwarded it to the appropriate regulatory body as technically required. When a reporter started asking questions about a Whitmore Foundation scholarship recipient, whose father happened to be a city planning official, I didn't intervene to provide context or explain the completely coincidental timing. I simply let the truth breathe. Everything I did was entirely legal, completely within my job responsibilities. I was following protocols, being thorough, ensuring compliance. I was just no longer going above and beyond to protect my father from the consequences of his own decisions. The changes were subtle, incremental. No single action was dramatic enough to notice, but like hairline cracks in a foundation, they would add up. And when pressure was applied, they would spread. I had 2 months before the party. I spent them carefully, methodically, allowing truth to surface in a dozen small ways. An article here about questionable donation timing. A regulatory inquiry there about construction variances. A vendor quietly mentioning to industry contacts that Whitmore contracts were becoming more demanding. Nothing explosive. Nothing that would trigger immediate crisis. Just enough friction to make investors slightly nervous. Enough questions to make board members slightly uncomfortable. Enough doubt to make my father's image of untouchable dominance start to show cracks. And through it all, I maintained my role perfectly. Quiet, competent, invisible, the daughter who knew her place. Right up until the moment I decided to step out of it. October 15th arrived with perfect autumn weather. The kind of evening Manhattan does best.
Crisp air, clear skies.
The city lights are just starting to glow against the sunset. I arrived at the Riverside Grand at 7. Not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to be noticed. Right in the middle of the arriving crowd. I'd chosen my dress carefully. Navy blue. Elegant but not attention-seeking. Appropriate for a family member without trying to compete. With Ava, who I knew would be wearing something spectacular. I was right.
She arrived 20
minutes later in a stunning emerald gown that probably cost more than my monthly rent.
She
Looked perfect.
poised.
Every inch the heir apparent. My father held court near the windows, the Manhattan skyline his backdrop. He looked genuinely happy, surrounded by people celebrating him, his legacy, his success, his version of the story. I circulated through the crowd, smiled at people who vaguely recognized me, made small talk with board members who had to be reminded how I fit into the family structure. "Oh, you're Charles's other daughter. Of course. You work in operations, is that right?"
Yes.
That's right. Operations. The invisible machinery. At 8 o'clock, the formal program began. The orchestra quieted. Guests gathered. Champagne glasses were refreshed. A board member gave a speech about my father's vision and leadership. A prominent investor shared a story about Charles Whitmore's business acumen. Ava spoke beautifully about our father's legacy and her commitment to honoring it. The room applauded each speaker, laughed at appropriate moments, raised glasses in toasts. Then, at exactly 8:17 p.m., my father stepped to the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming, reflected on his journey from struggling developer to Manhattan titan, spoke about the importance of legacy and family. Then he turned to Ava. "My daughter Ava represents everything I've built and everything the Whitmore Group will become. Her intelligence, her drive, her understanding of what it takes to succeed at this level. These qualities will take our company even further than I could have imagined." He raised his glass. "If I had only one daughter, it would be her." The room erupted in applause. 300 people celebrated the perfect father-daughter moment. And I stepped forward. The movement caught my father's attention. His smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected me to approach. Hadn't planned for me to be part of this moment. "Lauren." His voice was quieter now, uncertain. "Did you want to say something?" I took the microphone. My hands were steady.
My voice was calm.
"I do, actually."
Thank you, Dad.
I turned to face the room. 300 pairs of eyes, including my father's, including Ava's. Most of you don't know me well. I'm Charles Whitmore's older daughter. I've worked in operations at the Whitmore Group for 6 years. Behind the scenes, managing the details that keep projects smoothly. Polite nods, a few curious looks. Tonight is about celebrating my father's legacy. And I think it's important that we all understand exactly what that legacy includes. The room's energy shifted.
Slightly.
A ripple of uncertainty. My father's smile was gone now. "Lauren," he said quietly, "this isn't the time." I ignored him. Over the past 6 years, I've had access to every major contract, every compliance document, every internal audit of Whitmore Group projects. And I've noticed some interesting patterns.
I pulled out a small folder.
Inside were documents I'd carefully selected, copied, organized. Nothing classified, nothing stolen, just public records and internal documents I was authorized to access. For example, this timeline shows Whitmore Foundation scholarship recipients and their family, members' professional roles. You'll notice several interesting coincidences with permit approvals. I passed the document to the nearest board member. This is a summary of building code variance requests and subsequent inspection scheduling. The patterns are noteworthy. Another document circulated, and this is a list of vendor contracts with language that may not comply with updated conflict of interest disclosure requirements. The room was completely silent now. I looked at my father. His face had gone pale. Not with anger, with recognition. He understood what was happening. "I want to be clear," I continued. "Nothing I'm sharing is illegal. Everything here is documented, verified."
True.
I'm not making accusations. I'm simply providing information that I think shareholders, board members, and the public should have access to. I turned back to the crowd. My father taught me that truth matters, that integrity is everything, that legacy is built on more than just success. It's built on how that success was achieved. I raised my glass. So, here's to Charles Whitmore, and to the full truth of his legacy. I drank and waited. For exactly 7 seconds, nothing happened. Then the room exploded. Not with anger, with motion. Phones came out. Board members huddled. Investors started whispering urgently. Journalists in attendance suddenly looked very alert. My father stood frozen at the microphone, his carefully constructed moment completely shattered. Ava was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger. Something closer to
Shock.
like she was seeing me for the first time and couldn't reconcile this person with the sister she thought she knew. A board member approached my father, spoke quietly but urgently. 2 more joined them, then 4. Victoria, my stepmother, appeared beside Ava, tried to guide her away from the growing chaos. The orchestra had stopped playing. Guests were leaving, not dramatically but steadily. Important people making quiet exits. A reporter approached me. Ms. Whitmore, can you elaborate on the documentation you reference? Everything I mentioned is part of public record or appropriately disclosed company documents. I'd recommend requesting information through proper channels. More reporters gathered. Did your father know you were planning this? My father has always known what I'm capable of. He chose not to pay attention. Is this about being excluded from succession planning? I smiled. This is about truth. Whatever follows from that is simply consequence. I saw my father pushing through the crowd toward me. His expression was no longer shocked. It was fury.
Lauren, we need to talk. Now.
We're your birthday party, Dad. Wouldn't want to be rude to your guests. You just destroyed everything I've built.
No.
I revealed it. There's a difference. His hands were shaking, actual physical trembling. I'd never seen my father lose control like
This.
You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done. I've given people information they deserve to have.
What they
do with it is up to them. Ava appeared beside him. Her face was composed, but her voice was tight. Lauren, can we please discuss this privately? We discussed this 3 weeks ago, Ava. You told me this is how families like ours survive.
I'm
just following your advice, doing what's necessary. That's not what I meant, isn't it though? Security was approaching. My father must have called them. Ms. Whitmore, we need to ask you to leave. I set down my champagne glass. Of course. I've said everything I came to say anyway. I walked toward the exit. The crowd parted. Some people looked horrified. Others looked fascinated. One board member, an older woman named Patricia Chun, who'd always been polite to me, made eye contact as I passed. She nodded, just slightly. I nodded back. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean. I could hear the Hudson River lapping against the embankment. The city lights sparkled. Behind me, through the windows, I could see chaos spreading through my father's perfect celebration, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The next 72 hours were extraordinary. The documents I'd referenced became the foundation for 3 major investigations. The Times ran a piece on development industry practices and conflicts of interest using Whitmore Group as a case study. The city's Department of Buildings opened an inquiry into variance approval procedures. Several board members quietly requested emergency meetings to discuss governance concerns. None of it was dramatic. No criminal charges. No handcuffs or perp walks. Just the slow, inexorable tightening of accountability around a man who'd spent decades avoiding it. My father didn't go to jail, but he lost something more valuable to him than freedom. He lost certainty. The Whitmore Group stock price dropped 11% in the first week. Not catastrophic, but enough to concern investors. Enough to trigger margin calls on leveraged positions. Enough to make banks suddenly very interested in reviewing loan covenants. Board meetings that had once been formalities became contentious. Patricia Chun, the board member who'd nodded to me at the party, started asking questions. Detailed questions about governance procedures, about oversight mechanisms, about succession planning, transparency. Other board members joined her, not because they were outraged by what I'd revealed. Most of them had suspected some of it
Anyway,
but because I'd made it public. And public problems require public responses. My father's carefully cultivated image as an ethical visionary started cracking. Articles no longer led with his success story. They led with questions, with patterns, with concerns. The philanthropic foundations that had loved hosting Charles Whitmore at galas became suddenly busy when his team reached out. The politicians who'd taken his calls immediately started letting them go to voicemail. The social invitations slowed, then stopped. Charles Whitmore was still wealthy, still powerful in absolute terms, but his trajectory had reversed. And in Manhattan's elite circles, decline is more damaging than outright failure, because failure can be explained. Bad timing, market forces, unforeseeable circumstances. But decline suggests something worse. It suggests you weren't as untouchable as everyone believed. Ava handled it differently than my father expected. She didn't defend him publicly, didn't issue statements of unwavering support, didn't tie herself to his sinking reputation. Instead, she distanced herself.
strategically, carefully.
In interviews, she emphasized her own vision for the Whitmore Group, her commitment to transparency, her recognition that the company needed to evolve beyond its founder's era. She was doing exactly what my father had taught her, surviving, even if it meant sacrificing him. The irony was exquisite. My father had created a daughter who valued winning above all else, who understood that loyalty was a liability if it threatened your position. And now she was using those exact lessons against him. He called me once, 3 weeks after the party. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won.
Lauren.
His voice sounded older, tired in a way I'd never heard before. Dad, I need you to stop. Whatever else you're planning, whatever other documents you have, I need you to stop. I'm not planning anything else. I've already said everything that needed to be said. Then tell people that. Issue a statement. Say you were emotional, that you regret the timing, that the information was taken out of context. But it wasn't taken out of context. Everything I said was accurate. Silence on the line. Then, why did you do this? The question surprised me. After everything, he still didn't understand. You really don't know? If this is about succession planning, we can discuss it. There might be room for a different arrangement, a co-leadership structure perhaps, or a phased transition that includes you. Dad, this was never about wanting a position in your empire. Then what was it about? I thought about that question, about all the years of dismissal, all the times he'd looked through
Me instead of at me.
all the lessons he'd taught about power and ruthlessness and the uselessness of empathy. You told me once that I was too soft to matter, that love without power is useless. Do you remember that? Lauren, I say a lot of things. I'm trying to teach you both how the world actually works.
No.
You were teaching us how you think the world works. But you were wrong about something crucial. What's that? You thought power was about dominance, about being untouchable, about making people afraid to challenge you. That's exactly what power is.
No, Dad.
That's what power looks like when you're insecure. Real power doesn't need to dominate. It doesn't need to erase people who remind you of your past. It doesn't need to choose between daughters. This is naive. Is it? Because right now you're losing everything you built. Not because of my attack. Because of your own decisions. I just stopped hiding them for you. He was quiet for a long moment. You've become someone I don't recognize. Good. The person you recognized was invisible. This version of me is finally real. I hung up before he could respond. That was the last conversation we ever had. I thought the story was over. I'd revealed my father's vulnerabilities, watched his empire begin its slow decline, made peace with losing the family I'd never really had. I was ready to move on. Then Ava made her move. It started small. An article in the Wall Street Journal about new leadership at the Whitmore Group. Ava was named CEO, effective immediately. My father was transitioning to a chairman, emeritus role, advisory only. The article praised Ava's vision, her commitment to modernizing the company, her recognition that change was necessary. It painted her as the reformer, the daughter who'd learned from her father's mistakes and was charting a better course. I almost believed it. Then I received a call from Patricia Chun, the board member who'd supported the governance inquiries. Lauren, we need to meet. There's something you should know. We met at her office in Midtown. Patricia was in her 60s, elegant and sharp. She'd made her fortune in tech before joining various corporate boards. She was nobody's fool. I'm going to be direct, she said. Did you know Ava has been positioning for a takeover for almost a year? A takeover? She's already the heir. Dad was giving her everything. Not a takeover of the company, a takeover of the narrative. Patricia pulled out her own folder. Inside were emails, board communications, strategic memos, all from Ava. Your sister has been documenting your father's questionable decisions for months. Long before you revealed anything at the party. She's been building a case to the board that Charles was becoming a liability, that his judgment was compromised, that the company needed younger, more ethical leadership. I stared at the documents, but she told me she only knew about the succession plan for 6 or 7 months. She lied. She's known for over a year, and she's been actively working to accelerate your father's decline. Patricia handed me another document. This is an email Ava sent to 3 key board members 2 weeks before your father's party. She suggests that Charles's judgment has been increasingly erratic and that family dynamics may be affecting his objectivity. She recommends beginning a quiet evaluation of leadership alternatives. The date on the email was October 1st, 2 weeks before the party. Ava had been planning this before I'd even confronted her at the coffee shop. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Because I thought you should know that your sister didn't just choose silence when you confronted her. She chose to use you. The realization hit like cold water. She knew I'd react to the succession plan. She was counting on it. Your sister is brilliant, Lauren. Possibly more calculating than your father ever was. She understood that if the information about Charles's practices came from her, it would look like betrayal, like ambition, overriding loyalty. But if it came from me, it looks like justified anger from an overlooked daughter. Emotional, perhaps, but credible. And it gives her the perfect opportunity to step in as the ethical alternative. The daughter who recognizes the need for change, who's willing to break from her father's legacy for the good of the company. I felt sick. She manipulated me. She created conditions where you would do exactly what she needed you to do. And then she capitalized on the chaos you created. I looked at the emails again. Ava's careful language, her strategic timing, the way she'd positioned every piece exactly where it needed to be. She hadn't just chosen silence in our coffee shop conversation. She'd been testing me, seeing if I'd take the bait, confirming that I was angry enough, hurt enough to make the public revelation she needed but couldn't make herself. There's more, Patricia said quietly. She handed me one final document. It was a proposal Ava had submitted to the board, dated 3 days after the party. The subject line read, Restructuring Plan, Whitmore Group. Inside was a comprehensive reorganization, new governance structures, enhanced oversight, transparency initiatives, and buried in Section 7, Subsection C, elimination of non-essential legacy positions and stakeholder roles. My position. Ava wasn't just taking over the company. She was completing my erasure, using the chaos I'd created to justify removing me entirely. "She's more dangerous than your father ever was," Patricia said. Charles was ruthless, but he was predictable. He wanted to win. Ava wants to win and be celebrated for it. She wants power and the moral high ground, and she's willing to sacrifice anyone, including you, to get both. I sat in that office for a long time after Patricia left, trying to process what my sister had become, or maybe what she'd always been, and I'd been too naive to see. Ava hadn't just chosen silence. She'd weaponized it. I didn't confront Ava immediately. I did what she'd taught me, though she didn't know she was teaching it. I watched. I waited. I planned. And I realized something crucial. Ava had made the same mistake my father had. She'd underestimated me. She thought the party revelation was my entire play. An emotional outburst. A moment of justified anger that she could then exploit for her own purposes. She had no idea it was just the opening move. Remember when I said I'd spent 2 months allowing truth to breathe? Letting small cracks form. In my father's foundation, I'd actually spent 6 months doing something else. Building my own documentation. Not of my father's questionable practices. Of Ava's. Because while everyone was watching my father's empire, I was watching my sister's ascent. And I noticed things. How she'd structured certain deals to benefit shell companies she had undisclosed interests in. How she'd used Whitmore Foundation resources for personal networking that blurred ethical
lines.
How she'd leveraged company relationships for private investments that created conflicts of interest. Nothing my father didn't also do. But Ava had positioned herself as the ethical reformer, which meant she was vulnerable in a way my father never was. My father never pretended to be a saint. He was ruthless and owned it. Ava's entire takeover was built on moral superiority, on being better than our father, and I had proof she wasn't. 3 months after the party, the Whitmore Group held its annual shareholder meeting.
Ava
Gave a beautiful presentation, talked about the company's new direction, the commitment to transparency, the lessons learned from past mistakes. She was poised, confident, commanding. She looked every inch the leader she'd always wanted to be. Then, during the Q&A session, Patricia Chun asked a question. "Ms. Whitmore, given your emphasis on ethical governance, can you explain the structure of Meridian Capital Partners and its relationship to several Whitmore Group vendor contracts?" The room went very quiet. Ava's composure flickered. Just for a second. "I'm not familiar with that entity." "Really? Because public filings show you as a founding partner. And Meridian has received over $14 million in contracts from Whitmore Group subsidiaries over the past 18 months. All during the period when you were overseeing vendor relations." Patricia pulled out documents. My documents. The ones I'd spent 6 months compiling. There are also questions about foundation resource usage, personal expenses charged to charitable accounts, networking events billed as philanthropic initiatives. Another board member joined in, and these investment partnerships that seemed to mirror Whitmore Group market positions. Positions you would have had advanced knowledge of through your executive role. The questions kept coming, each one precise, documented, undeniable. Ava tried to maintain control, offered explanations, promised to provide additional context. But the damage was done, because Ava had built her entire claim to leadership on being ethically superior to our father. And I'd just proven she wasn't. She'd simply been better at hiding it. After the meeting, Ava found me in the hallway. Her composure was gone. Her voice was shaking. "That was you." "Yes." "How long have you been planning this?" "Since you told me this is how families like ours survive. I decided to learn the lesson properly." "Lauren, we can fix this. We can work together. You've made your point. Now, let's find a solution that benefits us both." I smiled. "Ava, I don't want to work together. I don't want a position in your empire. I don't want to fix this." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to understand something you never learned. You thought you were playing chess, while I was playing checkers. You thought you were the strategic one, the brilliant one, the one who understood how power really works. And you were so busy manipulating me, using me, positioning yourself that you never considered I might be doing the same thing to you. The realization spread across her face. The party.
You wanted me to use that.
You knew I'd capitalize on it. I counted on it. I needed you to feel untouchable, to believe you'd won, because people are careless when they think they've already won. So, this entire time, I was watching you the same way you were watching Dad. Documenting, preparing, waiting for the perfect moment. Ava's voice dropped to a whisper. What happens now? Now? The board is going to ask questions. Investigators are going to review your deals. The same media that praised you as the ethical reformer is going to examine whether you're just a more sophisticated version of what you claimed to oppose. This will destroy the company.
No.
It will force actual change, real transparency, genuine accountability, not the performative kind you were offering. And what about you? What do you get out of this? I thought about that question. Freedom. The knowledge that neither you nor Dad can ever dismiss me again. The certainty that I'm not too soft to matter. I started to walk away.
Lauren, wait.
I turned back. Ava looked smaller somehow. Younger. Like the sister I'd once known was briefly visible. Beneath the armor she'd built. I'm sorry. For what it's worth. I'm sorry for choosing silence.
For using you.
For becoming exactly what Dad wanted me to be. It was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I know you are, Ava. But sorry doesn't undo choices. It just acknowledges them. That was the last time I saw my sister. The media called it the Whitmore implosion. Within 6 months, both my father and Ava had resigned from the Whitmore group. Not because they were forced out by scandal, but because the board implemented actual governance reforms that made their style of leadership impossible. Real oversight, independent audits, conflict of interest policies with teeth. The things that should have existed all along. Patricia Chun became interim CEO. Under her leadership, the company stabilized. Not as flashy as under my father. Not as ambitious as under Ava. But sustainable, ethical,
real.
I was offered a position on the new board. I declined. Because the story doesn't end with me taking their throne. It ends with me building my own. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, I launched my own development consultancy. Small projects, affordable housing, community partnerships, everything my father's empire had. Ignored in pursuit of luxury high-rises. I used everything he taught me about development, and everything he'd failed to teach me about humanity. My first project was a mixed-income residential building in Brooklyn. Nothing glamorous.
No.
Crystal chandeliers or imported marble. Just well-designed, affordable homes for people who'd been priced out of the neighborhoods they'd built. The profit margins were smaller than Whitmore Group projects, but the impact was bigger, and I slept better than I had in years. But here's the part that still surprises people. The real ending to this story. 2 years after everything fell apart, I received a letter from my father. He was dying. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Months left, maybe weeks. He wanted to see me. I almost threw the letter away. Then I thought about who I'd become. About the lessons I'd learned. About whether I wanted to carry his bitterness forward or leave it behind. I went to see him. He was in a hospital room in Manhattan.
Thin. Gray.
Diminished in ways that had nothing to do with illness. Lauren, you came. I came. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said something I never expected. I was wrong about you. About what specifically? About everything. You weren't too soft. You were too strong. Strong enough to care about things beyond winning. Strong enough to risk everything for truth. Strong enough to walk away from power when it was finally offered. Dad, I thought I was teaching you both how to survive, how to be powerful, how to matter in a world that only respects strength.
His voice cracked.
But I just taught you to be alone. Like me. I wanted to feel triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of finally being seen. Instead, I just felt sad. You're not alone now, I said quietly. Aren't I? Ava hasn't visited. Your mother wants nothing to do with me. The business partners, who used to call daily, haven't checked in once. I have wealth, resources, a legacy, supposedly. He looked at me with eyes that finally saw me clearly. But I have no one who actually cares if I live or die. I could have left then, let him sit with the consequences he'd earned. But I didn't. I stayed. Not because I forgave him. Not because his deathbed recognition erased decades of dismissal. But because I'd learned something he never had. That showing up for people, even people who don't deserve it, is how you stay human. I visited my father twice a week for the last 2 months of his life. We didn't talk much. Sometimes we watched old movies. Sometimes I read to him. Sometimes we just sat in silence. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was holding his hand. People ask me if I regret what I did, if I wish I'd handled things differently, if I ever feel guilty about destroying my family's empire. And here's what I tell them. I didn't destroy anything. I revealed what was already broken. My father built an empire on the belief that power is everything, that winning justifies any cost, that love and loyalty are weaknesses to be exploited. And he died alone, wealthy beyond measure, with no one who truly mourned him. Ava built her ambition on the same foundation. She learned his lessons perfectly. She became everything he wanted her to be, and she lost herself in the process. I chose a different path. Not because I'm better than them, not because I'm more ethical or more enlightened, but because I learned the one lesson my father never intended to teach. That being powerful and being right aren't the same thing. That winning at the cost of your humanity is the deepest loss. That the people who dismiss you often underestimate you in ways that become their downfall. Today, I run a small but growing development firm. I work with communities, not against them. I build homes, not monuments to ego. I measure success by impact, not by domination. The profit margins are smaller. The recognition is quieter. The power is less absolute. But I wake up every morning knowing exactly who I am. And I don't need my father's approval to know I matter. That's a freedom neither he nor Ava ever found. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the invisible one in your family, the overlooked one, the one people underestimated, I want you to know something. Your invisibility is not your weakness. It's your strategic advantage. The people who don't see you don't know what you're capable of. And when you're ready, when you've learned enough and prepared enough and become strong enough, you can step into the light on your own terms. Not for revenge, for freedom. That's the real victory. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing. I share real stories about family, power, and the courage it takes to choose truth over comfort. And remember, the daughter they never saw coming is often the one who changes everything. Thank you for listening.